This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. This is our second learning community this year, but it is now our third year of doing these faculty learning communities. And they are a collaboration with Center for Teaching and Learning, headed up by Donna Elkins, and the Quality Enhancement Plan in Writing. So I'm Lizzie Caraway. I'm the QEP coordinator. And for those who are less familiar with the QEP, the title of the QEP is Writing Through Revision. And one of the main pieces of the QEP is incorporating peer review into classes. So each department selected 3 writing intensive courses that kind of follow their students from their early courses in the major to the capstone and later courses in the major. And in those classes, people emphasize writing as a process. And so actually what Dr. Parmenter will be presenting, she actually submitted for the Writing to Learn Award last year, which she won. And the Writing to Learn Award will be opening up in the next couple of weeks. You'll see some communication about it. And that's just a chance we have like a list of things that we're looking for that I'll send out with that, kind of different like best practices. And people just submit their syllabi, explanations of assignments, that kind of thing. And we were in the past able to offer professional development funds as an award, but since those accounts or that has been frozen, we now are offering a $200 book award. So we make purchases based on someone's wish list, and because teachers love books, so we figured that was a good compromise. So yeah, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Parmenter now.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. It was very nice to receive the books from my wish list this past summer. I bought books that I was using for a research project, and I've read them all, so that was very nice. And I encourage others to apply for this award. Even if the award isn't what it was in past years, it's quite an honor to receive this, so thank you very much. I want to tell you a little bit today about the techniques that I used in this particular writing intensive course. I had taught this course, a 200 level course that's required for liberal studies majors. So this is one of our writing intensive courses, special topics in interdisciplinary studies. And the topic of this class was ritual. But what students may not realize when they enter the class and other disciplinary classes that we teach is that we're not teaching so much about what ritual is about in this case, but instead we're teaching what it means to be interdisciplinary. And it's really interesting, since we're talking about writing here, it's interesting to think about how the process of interdisciplinarity pretty much maps right onto the process of writing through revision. You have to figure out how to put different parts together, how to revise, how to integrate. And so teaching some of these writing techniques in the class actually helped me to teach about interdisciplinary studies also. So there are 2 things I did in this class that I wanted to talk about, and feel free to ask questions as we go along here. There'll also be time for questions or just general discussion at the end, I'm sure. I did 2 things, and one of them is scaffolding, which I think is something that many instructors do. That's not really anything new. I just sort of wanted to explain how everything in the course is scaffolded and contributes to larger writing projects as we go along. But one thing that I started doing in this class, which I'm not sure I've heard other instructors doing before, is extended drafting and peer review, what that means is for the final project, we didn't just have a peer review session and then students revised and turn in their final paper. We did 2 rounds of that. And so I'll explain that as we go along. I have used many of these techniques in other classes as well. I use them for classes where writing is the primary assessment. I have some classes where learning information and quizzes and tests are the primary assessment. But for several courses, I found that this kind of scaffolding of daily assignments into weekly assignments into one final project works fairly well, as long as students sort of understand the patterning of what's taking place. In this, I'll just talk about this class, even though I use it in other classes. In this class, every day there's some sort of writing that goes on. And I'm also going to be talking about how I use this in a face-to-face class. I have had to transfer some of these activities into online classes, and maybe at the end we can talk about how those work or didn't work quite as well. So I'm talking about face-to-face class here. Every day in a 4 times a week undergraduate face-to-face class, students would be expected to come in with having read an assignment and having notes on that assignment. And then in class, there'd be a writing activity, which I call the WTL, Writing to Learn, Daily Writing to Learn activity. And then on a weekly basis, 3 of those different days writing activities would then feed into a weekly paper. And then by the end of the course, 4 of those weekly papers would feed into the final project paper. And so there's repetition at all these levels. There's a chance for revision of ideas at all these levels, so that hopefully by the end of the project, students don't have to spend so much time with the writing the information that has already been provided. Instead, they can be more creative in their final project and really use what they've learned. So I'll just go through each of these a little bit to give you examples of what these daily activities are like. So with these daily reading assignments and the daily writing to learn activities, this is an example of a daily homework assignment. There'd be 2 fairly short readings, maybe a total of 12, 15 pages of reading, something like that. And my expectation is that the students are going to create an outline of what they've read. They don't always do that, but I do encourage them to create an outline of what they read, and we talk about outlining. And then I also give them guided questions for the reading. So everything you see on the screen here is what I would give students for their homework assignment. The general reading assignment, but then also the things to focus on with very specifically worded questions. So for what students do outside of class is basically reading and note taking and thinking about these questions. And so in terms of the writing process, I explain to the students that, you know, this is a part of the writing process, that the reading and the note taking is sort of the preparatory materials for writing. I also am very particular that the students are going to learn a certain style of writing. And in this class, we used APA style. I teach different styles in different classes, but it made the most sense for this topic. And so in the materials that I give to the students, I give them the APA formatting, so that later in the class, if they're making a references page for their paper, all they have to do is cut and paste from what I've given them here. And so I'm hoping that that gets them used to the style, and if they're paying attention, they can see, okay, this is how this style works, so that if I need to generate my own reference, these are the parts that are involved. And then also when I'm wording the questions, I model APA style. Okay, so that's what students do outside of class, or they're expected to anyway. And then when they come to class, they are expected to use their notes. And the first thing that happens in a class is what I call these daily writing to learn activities, where students will use their notes. They can use their notes, but not the actual text of the reading assignment. So that kind of makes them have notes. And I ask a very specific question that's related to what they prepared. Now, sometimes I will ask an exact question that they should have prepared. But it's really my preference to ask and prepare from their notes. But they can use their notes to then write a paragraph that goes along with what they prepared for the day. And I give them basically the beginning of the sentence for the writing prompt, and I want them to write this as well, because then that gets them used to writing APA style. But also, an important lesson for the class is learning different theorists' perspectives. And so if the sentence is modeled like this, naming the theorist, and then they explain what is going on in the theory, that's the kind of thing that I want them to do in the papers that they write. Always identify, this is what so-and-so said, and then you provide a citation. So I've mentioned some of the benefits of this already. For these paragraphs, I do collect them each day and I do grade them. So while it is sort of a pre-writing exercise, in order to prompt the students to actually do their reading assignment and take notes and be ready for in class, I do grade these, but I grade them only on content and not on writing. They're writing them by hand. They're usually writing these paragraphs in about 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. And so I'm not expecting high quality writing, just sort of did they get the general idea. And I explained this one already. The prompts are crafted so that students think through their notes rather than just copying from their notes, because this doesn't really work as well if students are just copying from their notes over and over again. I'm hoping that this writing quickly in class is going to model for them sort of starting a draft or just starting paragraphs that might feed into a paper draft. And hopefully students note the importance of just getting their ideas out on the paper. They don't have to have a well-crafted paragraph for this stage of their writing. They just need to get the ideas out there. And then this is part of scaffolding, because each daily writing task is going to feed into a weekly writing task that is much larger. Okay, so short weekly papers, basically 3 or 4 days worth of class discussions and homework that the students have done, and these small writing to learn paragraphs will then feed into a weekly paper. It's a paper of about 2 pages, and it's a fairly rigid in terms of content, that basically students are supposed to have particular content that they've built up through the week. So this is not an exercise in creative writing, but can you express the ideas of the course for the week through writing? These weekly papers do then go through the peer review process. So we would take a whole class period and we would go to the writing center and do small group facilitated peer reviews. And so this happened 3 times in the course. So students got used to that peer review process. And so for these shorter papers, they're learning the process of writing a larger paper, drafting, peer review, revisions, using citations. They do have to have references pages, even though they're very short papers, and even though they're just cut and paste, so students can see what's expected. Each of the 3 weekly papers that they write related to different disciplines and how the discipline study ritual all have the same guidelines. And so the sense of repetition, I hope, is useful. So students just get used to what is to be expected in a paper like this. In the class, there is a fourth paper that is integrated into the final paper. It's close to the end of the class, so we don't go through peer review for that fourth paper. And the reason for that is we don't have time, basically, but also the ideas of that fourth paper on interdisciplinary studies can be revised in the final peer review process for the final project too. So just seemed like there were too many peer reviews too close together right at the end of the class, so they got folded in. The weekly papers, these are summaries of basically the content for the week. And so my hope is that students only need to deal with their weekly papers as they are getting ready to write their final paper. They don't need to go back into their notes. They don't need to go back into the original readings. They just go back into the stage before the final project. And the final project that I have for this class then is then taking those 4 weekly papers, putting them together, and then doing something creative with it. So part of this final 5 to 8 page paper is just explaining how the different disciplines study ritual. So they can just cut and paste information from their previous papers, but they're also doing something new with it. So they have to show how they use that information to create a new rite of passage. We were focusing on rite of passages here. So hopefully if they've already mastered the earlier material, they can spend time being more creative with that inventor ritual idea. And as we're gearing up for the final project, I do have all these different writing stages integrated into the class assignments, and each of them carries a point value. So trying to give them incentive to actually do all these different writing steps. So the first one is creating an outline of the final paper, and I encourage students just to cut and paste from what they've done before for the part that is just repetition. Then students discuss their outline in class and can get verbal feedback from each other about their outline. Then students submit a first draft, and we do facilitated peer review at the Writing Center. Just to give you an idea of the timing for this, so in a undergraduate 4 days a week class, the outline would have been due on a Friday. This draft 1 would have been due on a Tuesday. Discussing the drafts, I did conferences with students on Wednesday, and then students were to submit another draft of the paper on Thursday, and then their revised and polished final paper we need to make a better finished product. Now, the reason I decided to add in more drafting, more peer review, is that I found in general when students were especially working on final projects, when they'd come in for a peer review, they would come in with a partial draft. And then they'd use the peer review session to sort of finish their draft. And they would never get around to revising and editing. They would get feedback to finish the content of their draft, but the revising aspect sort of fell away. So I was hoping by extending this out that students could more easily see what the expectations were in terms of you have a finished final draft, a finished draft for the first peer review, and then you actually revise, you actually change it and make it better. add in the content that there may have been some issues with, revise that as well for the second draft. And then there'd be time for polishing and editing, which I find students tend to not do. So the expectation was that you would do all these steps. I think some students understood that. Some students just sort of used more time to finish their draft and didn't do the review that I would like. But I think there are benefits of doing that anyway, which I'll talk about in a minute. So I'm wrapping this up, so feel free to jump in with any questions, but I just thought I'd give an evaluation of this, what I think the benefits are of this kind of daily scaffolding. Everything feeds into each other. I think that if students really understand what's going on, it's fairly easy. I tend to think very deliberately through all these things. I tend to think about the flow and relationship of assignments. And I think students who can meet me in that and understand how I'm trying to explain it, I don't think it's all that difficult for them. And I have had feedback from students about how they appreciate how organized everything is. I'm sure that's related to personality styles, that's related to different kinds of learning styles. But hopefully, the goal of this is obviously to make everything easier for students so that they can become better writers by having a facilitated, kind of smooth process that's repeated over and over again in the class. I'm hoping that this kind of repetition lets students know that they know what's coming up the next week. They know what's coming up for the rest of the course if they can see how everything fits together. But the problem I have had with this kind of scaffolding, I'm not quite sure what to do about this, is that if students don't do the smaller tasks that you're asking them to do, like the daily writing assignments, if they don't do those and they can't do their daily in-class writing, then they've got to do a weekly paper basically starting from scratch. Or if they've missed a weekly paper, that makes it very hard to do the final project. And so I need to constantly tell students that you got to stay on track with these things. And if they can't keep up with the daily things, then the larger projects are much more difficult. For this extended drafting and peer review, I've talked about many of these things already. So extending this process out to having 2 rounds of drafts, 2 rounds of peer review with lots of opportunity for feedback to make things better. I think students understand the expectations and they understand the writing stages a little better if those are built right into the class. If students are on board, I think this is very beneficial to them. And what I mentioned earlier is that they do have a complete first draft that really allows them time and space to revise, to edit, to really get a good, tight, finished paper, which is what I'm expecting them to do. But if they don't have a complete first draft, they use more time to just fill out their draft. There's benefit for that too, because that's likely a student who may have submitted an incomplete paper for their final project. So at least they have more time to get the whole thing out. So there's a benefit to that as well, even if they don't meet all the expectations to get around to polishing and editing and all of that. So I've had only good feedback about having more time to write final papers, for building that time into the class. And that's all I've got for you here. Appreciate your attention. Be glad to have a discussion about this, or we could talk about how this might translate into an online class. I've done parts of this process online.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I see Yoon Kyung, did you want to did you have a question that you need to show your screen for? I see a request to make you the presenter. Maybe she didn't mean to send that. Well, now I just want to open it up for folks who, if you have any questions for Dr. Parmenter, you can do a little Q&A. Yeah, Steve.
Did you find that by really folding all of the writing supports into your course that it got in the way of covering content?
Yeah, that's always the tricky thing. So for this class, it really worked because it was a writing intensive course and I built the class around the writing goals. But that, especially in other classes where there is a certain amount of content that I want to cover, it's more of an information based type class. I don't have time to do all these things. Now, in some of those classes, I do still do the daily writing prompts, but they wouldn't necessarily feed into larger projects. They might just help students remember the content of what they read as they're getting ready for an exam. So that's always the tricky thing. Thank you for bringing that up. So this really works when it's more of a writing course and less so when I'm trying to adapt another kind of course to bring in some of these elements.
Yeah, and I think Stacy had a question as well.
I actually have two questions, but let me build on what Steve was talking about there. My experience has also been when I offer a chance to turn in a grade that often, a draft, what I'll get is an outline and not really a full use of that opportunity. My experience has also been that asking for peer review sometimes produces information that's not really all that helpful other than great job. I like you. So I wonder about the question of evaluating those efforts. Did you attach any point values to those activities, or how do you incentivize doing it well?
Yeah, that's a tricky thing too. I have found that in the face-to-face peer review sessions, it was more likely, they were more likely to be productive and less of the just good job kind of thing. I would assign the different groups for peer review to make sure that there was at least one student in each group who I knew sort of understood the material well, was a good writer, and sort of willing to give feedback on content as well as on writing. And this sort of balance of writing and content, I think, is another tricky thing in the peer review session. Because very often the peer review is focused on, did you write this well? But also the peer review should be a time when students can give each other feedback and say, well, I'm not sure you fully understood this concept here. Maybe if you looked, and then give students help on how to go back and review or think about an idea a different way. So that balance of writing process in terms of articulating ideas clearly, but also having the right ideas to articulate, that's a tricky balance in peer review as well. In terms of assessing peer review, I would give students participation points for their peer review. And I could kind of listen, if we were in the writing center, I could kind of listen in on each group and kind of tell how things were going and who was participating and in what way, and would assess just participation for that to kind of get past the just good job kind of feedback.
Was that all or none points, or?
It's on a scale, yeah.
Okay.
So if I just heard a student's voice, like once, that would be kind of minimal participation. But if I heard, the sort of everyone in the group were equal participants and had helpful things to say, then I would give full participation points for that. Yeah, but there was no kind of written feedback on the students' own participation and peer review.
I was going to add one thing. One thing I think that is helpful about having the Writing Center facilitated, either if you're doing it in Canvas, if you have the Writing Center embedded in Canvas and actually commenting on peer reviews, or if you're doing it in person, is that the consultants really model for the other students what good feedback looks like. And I have noticed that students pick up on that really quickly. So they start using that similar language. And it happens, it happens pretty quickly. And so even without needing to attach like assessment to it to motivate them, I think if they just have someone to model it for them, that's usually enough to get like a more thoughtful response.
Yeah, I agree. And the only time I have not used the Writing Center facilitators for peer review is when I was really confident I had someone for each group who could basically be that Writing Center facilitator. Like one year I had several students in the class who were already working at the Writing Center, and they sort of knew what to do. They knew the right kind of language and how to encourage others to participate. So we didn't need to use the Writing Center then, but for the most part, I agree with Lizzie that students need that kind of modeling for how to give feedback.
One of the things that I've done as well is give students specific prompts about what kind of feedback to give. So sometimes I'll give them 2 or 3 questions and say, you know, respond to these questions when you're giving feedback to, you know, to a teammate. And I think that helps because it gives them some direction for what to look, you know, what to look for. But I also agree with what Lizzie and Dori have said about the Writing Center, because I have the Writing Center embedded in my class right now for the first time. And we just went through a first round of draft papers. And I've already noticed that some of the students, of course, the advantage of being online is I can see what feedback they're giving to each other. But I've already seen that some of the students are modeling the language from the Writing Center. Like you said, Lizzie, they're using the same, you know, kinds of phrases in their feedback. So yeah, that having it online, like I said, I don't know that there are a lot of advantages to it, but one of them is that you can see, you know, the feedback that everybody is getting.
Yeah, I've noticed that too when I've done online peer review, and I appreciate that kind of modeling. I think you do need to be careful because I think sometimes the students are using the right words without being specific to the paper that they're reading. Like they'll say, well, I think you could have better transitions or something. But, you know, you could just tell anybody. It doesn't, so that the students do need to be prompted to specifically address something in the paper and not just give very general comments on improving writing.
Yeah, I think that's where the prompted questions come in. I'll say, give an example of, you know, look for this specific thing, and then give an example of where you see it or where you think it could be, but it's not. And I think that helps. Yeah, it helps.
I think students also need encouragement to encourage their peers to do better. If that makes, I'm going to just say it this way, they need to be more critical about their peers' writing. Now, I know that it's important to encourage positive feedback and encourage what's done well in the paper, and I agree with that. But I think students don't necessarily students need to get beyond that too, because the improvement is going to come in when pointing out how something could be better, could be improved, or maybe just saying, I think you might want to think about this idea in a different way. That's a really important part of this as well.
Other questions?
I did have one other question about how you grade the drafts.
Yeah.
Because that mine has sort of been, if you do it and, you know, I can tell you've done, you've made a reasonable attempt, that I'm going to give you the points, the full points for that draft, even if it might have a lot of improvements that need to be made. But I just like to hear what your thoughts are about that.
No, that's basically what I do as well. So, but that's a tricky thing. Like for this draft one, I will basically say, I want to see that you hit all these different content areas. You know, that would mean you had a finished draft if you had all these things covered. And if it's not articulated well, that's fine. That doesn't really matter. So it's just sort of a did you do it or not for the first draft. And then I say, you know, if you only hit 3/4 of the areas you were supposed to, then you get 75% grade, you know, that kind of thing. So what's also difficult for me to figure out is sort of the point balance for these. So I kind of see the first draft as being the bigger project. You got to get a lot out to get the first draft done. And so if I'm remembering correctly, I had something like 15 points for the first draft and then 10 points for the second draft. And I had to be very clear that I had to see some revision. I had to see that you took the feedback of your peers into account and you made some changes in the second draft. So again, I had to tell students this doesn't mean you just finish the draft. You've made some revisions. And so I think maybe draft one, 15 points, draft two, 10 points, and then the revised and polished paper, I think is 25 points is how I usually do that. So it really is the most at the end. They have to have the best paper by the end, but trying to encourage that first draft is a substantial portion of the grade too. Did that answer your question?
Any other questions? Yes, Stacey.
Dori, I wonder if we could go back to how you were describing composition of the groups. In my experience, if you allow them to form their own groups, often you have them kind of segmented by ability, which is not ideal especially for the group that may tend to be struggling with the content or not good writers.
Yeah.
On the other hand, acknowledging that one of the best ways to learn is to teach it, I also wonder about the experience for the very brightest students or most capable writers. What it's like to be in a group where they're actually giving more help than they're giving, and is there a way to offset that effect? And I'm going to turn my camera off because I'm getting a lot of lags.
Dora, we aren't able to hear you right now. Do you have your mute on? No. Dori, we can't hear you. Would you repeat? So Dora, I just sent you a message in the chat. We weren't able to hear. So I'm wondering if maybe if you turn your camera off, that it might speed things up a little bit, or we might hopefully be able to hear you. Okay. I'm still unable to hear you. Maybe mute and unmute. It might just be the connection on campus isn't very strong. Dori, are you able to, can we test it out to see if we can hear you now? Okay. So sorry about that, Dora. We lost your response to Stacy's question. And I don't know if we'll be able to get your audio back here. But I did want to share something with everyone before we finish up. So I might move on to doing that. Dori, did you want to try to add anything? See if we can hear you. Yeah, I don't think we can. Well, one thing that I wanted to share with everyone is I've got the Writing Center embedded in my course for peer review. And let me switch, make myself the presenter here. Just 1 second. Okay, so I'm gonna share with folks kind of what the peer review looks like in Canvas and how I have it set up, because the Writing Center is not doing any in-person services right now. They're all doing like Zoom chats with students, or they're getting papers emailed. So let me share this screen with you. Can people see that? Is that big enough?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So you can see here, this is where they go to submit their papers for peer review. And I've got a list of questions here that I'd like them to address in their response to their peers. And I also say that peer review responses should be 200 words. And they have a few days to do those. There's also, you can see there's a place where you can add a rubric if you actually want students to be looking at the rubric for the assignment when they're giving each other feedback. But I just kind of wanted to show you what this looks like. So if I click on peer reviews, then I see each student has 2 peer reviews that were assigned to them. So the student name at the top, they are reviewing the 2 students that are listed below them. And you can see a check if they've finished the review, or there'll be an exclamation point if they have not done the review yet. One thing is that if students don't get their drafts submitted by the deadline, they won't have any papers assigned to them. They won't be part of the, that auto sort that happens when it gives 2 reviews per user. It does give you an option to add a submission for them to review. So if that student does submit a draft and you want them to participate in peer review, you can manually add those later. In this case, I didn't, because I figured if they're not, I don't want them to do the work of peer reviewing someone else if they're not going to get peer reviewed. And I was just going to show you also what this looks like. I'll pick a student who I haven't graded the draft at all. So if you click on one of the students that they've reviewed, then you see a screen that looks like this. And you can see that the Writing Center consultants' comments appear first. And then this is a student, the student's comment on that draft. And I actually haven't added my comment yet, but when I do, that will appear here as well. And I'll be able to see the grade I've assigned here. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like, and the students can't see one another's comments. So once a student submits their peer review response to someone, it just kind of disappears. So the student can't go to this page. The student can't see this page for any other student. They can only see the comments for themselves, which was something I was concerned. I didn't know if students would all be able to see what I had written to other students, but they're not able to do that. But for having a writing center in your class, you basically add, they give you a list of consultants to add as teaching assistants. You add them as teaching assistants to your class, and then they're able to be embedded in those peer reviews. So just wanted to share that with folks. We just have a couple minutes. Any other final thoughts or questions? I know we got delayed by the technology a little bit. Well, I appreciate everyone coming today, and I just wanted to remind you that our next faculty learning community is going to be on January 14th. And actually, we might be doing one in December, but we're still kind of working on that. But we will definitely have one on January 14th, and that will be Dr. Erica Lemberger will be sharing her, we always do like an assignment design workshop where someone's really sharing how they've structured an assignment. So it'll be somewhat similar to today. And as I said before, definitely keep a lookout for the Writing to Learn Award announcement. We'll start taking submissions in the next few weeks, and that'll remain open until February 19th for people to apply. So I think that's it. Thank you everybody so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.